Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second block of the Florida Race Equity Challenge, beginning the system analysis. Today's webinar is Utilizing Data. My name is Natalie Steiner, and I'll be your moderator for today. As we transition to our presenter, I'd like to explain some technical things to everyone. All of our audience members will be muted for today's webinar. If you take a look at the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a control panel with a red arrow button at the top. If you click that arrow, the full control panel will pop out and you'll see a chat box where you can submit questions you might have on today's content or technical issues to our staff. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker to everyone today. Karen Butterfield was born and raised in South Florida. She is a proud Gator and graduated with honors from the University of Florida with a degree in criminology. She has worked for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice for 14 years in many capacities and has served the last 4 years as the Justice Reform Coordinator to the Central Region. We are so excited to be here with you today, Karen.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. Again, my name is Karen Butterfield, and I'm very excited to share this presentation with you. As Natalie shared, while we're going through the presentation, please feel free to submit any questions in the chat box. Your regional coordinator will assist in answering your questions and provide you with the information you need. Additionally, we will take some of the frequently asked questions and send out the answers to everyone after the presentation. We're sincerely grateful for each of you who are continuing along with us on this journey of creating race equity throughout the juvenile justice system in Florida. You're here because you want to learn more and find ways that you and your agency can contribute to this change, and that is truly commendable. In Block 1, we focused on assessing your personal perspectives. Adam talked to us about our swords and shields and how we need to recognize and utilize those privileges to fight for and protect those who don't currently benefit from the same privileges. In the last webinar, Dr. Thomas and Mr. Boulder shared with us about implicit bias and how we need to recognize that we all have these unconscious biases that play a part in our daily decision-making. We need to be able to identify and bring these unconscious biases to the conscious mind in order to change them. Change can and will happen if we're each willing to look at ourselves and at our agencies to determine what we can do to stimulate the necessary changes needed in the systems we work within. Now that we have assessed our personal perspectives and have a better understanding of where we are at personally on this journey, we'll shift and start to focus on analyzing the system. Today, I will give you the tools that we will be using in our collaborative groups to start that analysis. We must use the race, equity, and inclusion lens in every facet of our lives and in the work we're doing. We're going to talk about utilizing data, and we'll be using the 7 steps to advance and embed race equity within your organization, which is taken from the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide, created by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Your regional coordinator will be sending you the full action guide after this presentation for your reference and utilization as we continue in the Florida Race Equity Challenge. During today's webinar, we will provide the framework for the work you'll be doing in your local collaboratives, introduce the 7 steps to advance and embed race equity within your organization, gain an understanding of the important role data plays in making necessary change. We'll review juvenile justice data in the state of Florida and learn how to utilize the data to identify areas of concern and assess your effectiveness of implemented change. Our first step towards advancing race equity here in Florida or anywhere else is going to be establishing an understanding of race equity and inclusion principles. Oftentimes, conversations about race can spoil or derail because people are using the same or similar terms in different ways. Establishing a shared language to present data, describe conditions and outcomes, and identify root causes of inequities serves a very important function in this work. A common language creates a narrative that makes it easier to communicate and creates a platform for coordinated work towards equitable outcomes. Building a framework for addressing issues of race begins with having a clear understanding and vision of racial equity and inclusion. It's not enough to be able to critique and react to race inequities. We also need to know how to create and proactively build racial equity. As many people can find it difficult to have these necessary conversations about race, we can shift the conversation from feelings of blame, guilt, shame, and grievance to one focused on causes, effects, systems, and solutions, using basic elements of effective issue framing to make a case by articulating shared values at stake. The problem, the cause, the solution, and the action needed help to create a complete frame that is clear, concise, compelling, and convincing. Focus on positive and widely shared values, such as fairness, equity, inclusion, unity, and dignity. So let's look at some of the common language and make sure we all have a clear understanding of these principles. Let's start by focusing on equity versus equality. While both aim to promote fairness and justice, equity takes into consideration that not everyone starts on an equal playing field, and therefore we need to treat everyone justly according to their circumstances, providing various levels of support and assistance depending on specific needs or abilities. Let's take a look at a quick scenario and determine whether this is an example of equity or equality. So a paramedic arrives on the scene of an accident and sees several people awaiting non-life-threatening medical care. One person has a large gash on their head, another person has a dislocated shoulder, and a third person requires stitches on their leg. The paramedic bandages up the head wound first. To be fair, she then proceeds to bandage the heads of the two others who needed medical care. Would this be an example of these people being treated equitably or equally? Please share your responses. Okay, about 50-50 in those responses. Thank you. So look a little bit more at it. So similar to the scenario we just discussed, in the top of the illustration on the screen, you will see that everyone was treated equally and given the same thing. In this case, a bicycle. That bike, however, is only a good fit for one of them to ride effectively. Treating these individuals equitably provides each of them with a bike specific to their needs to be able to ride successfully. Let's move on to some more of the core concepts we are dealing with when discussing race equity. Inclusion. When we're talking about inclusion, we are talking about more than simply diversity and numerical representation. Inclusion requires real and empowered participation and a true sense of belonging. Institutional racism is the inequity within institutions and systems of power, such as government agencies and social service agencies. This can take the form of unfair policies and practices, discriminatory treatment, and inequitable opportunities and outcomes. For example, a school system that concentrates people of color in the most overcrowded and under-resourced school with the least qualified teachers compared to the educational opportunities of white students. Systemic racialization is the well-institutionalized pattern of discrimination that cuts across major political, economic, and social organizations in a society. Public attention to racism is generally focused on individual racist actions rather than the system of racial inequality. Achieving the goal of race equity, of truly moving the fortified racial barriers our country has built over time, requires dedicated people using sophisticated tools to incorporate race equity and inclusion at every stage of the work for social change. So these are just a few of the core concepts related to race equity. However, the expectation is that you will review all of the core concepts outlined in the action guide with an understanding that we will be utilizing these standard terms and definitions in our collaborative groups to ensure clarity in our communication regarding race equity. Once you have an understanding of the principles of race equity, your next step will be engaging the affected populations and stakeholders. You need to invest significant time in learning about the culture and needs of the populations you're serving. Spend time understanding what other stakeholders are doing, examining what is working, and then sharing the information. This will help inform your work and allows early buy-in and support from stakeholders and the communities that you're serving. You should not only strive to engage stakeholders, but empower those who have an active and authentic connection to their respective community. It's important to ensure meaningful participation, voice, and ownership. To empower these stakeholders, you must ensure that everyone in your collaborative has equal power and an equal voice in conversations and decisions that are being made. The sooner you can engage stakeholders, the sooner you'll be able to move from talk to action in creating equitable opportunities for the communities you serve. Here's the stakeholder analysis guide that asks necessary questions to help in making sure you have a powerful mix of stakeholders to help leverage the change you want to see. Who is most adversely affected by the issue? What would the racial composition of the leadership look like? How can diverse communities be engaged from the outset so they have the opportunity to shape the solutions and strategies for change? Who will be allies and supporters, and how can they be engaged? Who needs to be recruited or invited to join the effort, and who's going to approach them? For those of you who have joined your local team, you have already begun building your collaborative. I challenge each of you to take a look at the collaborative groups you're a part of and continuously evaluate who is at the table and who is necessary that may be missing. I'd like to take a little time and get some feedback from you all as you think about your collaborative groups. Open up the chat box and share some examples of representation that you think are of importance in your collaborative groups. I'm going to ask Natalie to come join me after the time is up and share some of the responses, highlighting some specific ones that may be lacking in the typical collaboratives.
Thank you, everyone. It looks like we got a lot of great responses. Let's see, there's a few that came up that I really do want to highlight. The youth and family voice, community representation, local grassroots organizations, and faith-based partners.
Very good. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you all for sharing. Of course, when we're talking about doing work and making changes in the juvenile justice system, we would be remiss to not include the youth and family voice and those who are naturally connected to the communities we wish to serve. As you continue to think about those who are at the table and who needs to be there, you need to also continue to think about how to ensure you empower the community voice. Once you have an established collaborative group, you'll start gathering and analyzing data. Data is the key component in determining where your systems have inequity and will be the guiding source of the work in your collaborative. Because of this, data in all focus areas of organizations and systems should be broken apart by race, gender, and other demographic variables whenever it's available. The collection, analysis, and use of race and ethnicity data should be an integral part of the continuous improvement efforts, quality assurance, supervision, and accountability process of every organization and public system. If used both internally and with key contractual partners, this data can become an analytic tool to manage and effectively allocate resources necessary to help children and their families thrive. Using the data to understand not only the what, but also to determine the why to guide decisions is important so we all start and operate objectively from the same set of facts. During your next collaborative team meeting, your Justice Reform Coordinator will provide local data on 5 high-level data sets as a starting point. So let's jump in and take a look at some juvenile justice data in Florida. The data you see on the screen is statewide data from July 2018 through June 2019. First, as a baseline, we'll look at the makeup of the juvenile population in Florida. Black youth make up 21% of the youth population between 10 and 17 years old. White youth make up 43% of the youth population, and Hispanic youth make up approximately 33% of the youth population. Let's now look at the juvenile arrest rates in Florida during this time for our youth. When we're talking about arrests, we often use the word referrals interchangeably. If the same youth was charged with multiple offenses on the same date, these would be counted as a single arrest. Let's start by seeing where you think the numbers fall in a quick poll. While Black youth make up 21% of the youth population, what percentage of juvenile rates were for Black youth? All right, thank you. A lot of people think the numbers are pretty high. So let's look at what the data shows. Black youth make up 50% of the arrest referrals. White youth make up 33% of the arrests, and Hispanic youth make up 16% of the arrests. Next, we'll also look at the admissions to secure detention. These numbers count the number of admissions into the secure detention facility and does not include those youth supervised in the community on a detention status. So keeping in mind that Black youth make up only 21% of the youth population in Florida and 50% of the arrest referrals, the number comes in even higher for our Black youth being admitted to secure detention at 58%. White youth make up 27% of the admissions to secure detention, and Hispanic youth make up 15% of the admissions. In this snapshot of some higher level data, the red line shows where numbers should be if the rates of youth arrested and detained were proportionate and representative of the juvenile population. It's clear and disheartening that Black youth are highly overrepresented in the system, while other races and ethnicities are underrepresented in arrest rates and detention admissions. So let's also look at some of the outcomes of those juvenile arrests. Again, in comparison to the juvenile population, let's look at youth probation placements. While Black youth make up only 21% of the juvenile population, Black youth make up 51% of the probation placements. White youth make up 43% of the juvenile population. However, they make up 32% of the probation placements, and Hispanic youth, while making up 33% of the juvenile population, make up 16% of the youth probation placements. Now we'll also look at the numbers ordered to residential placements, also known as commitment. Black youth show an even greater disproportionate percentage of our committed youth, coming in at 61%. White youth make up 26% of the commitments to residential programs, and Hispanic youth make up only 12% of the commitments. This type of higher level data we like to call the what is only a starting point. This tells you what is, but will require more information and data digging to understand the why. I'd like you to think about and jot down some ideas for why you think the data looks the way that it does. During your next collaborative debrief, we'll ask you to share some of the ideas that you had with your collaborative team. After you've gathered some higher level data, you'll move on to step number 4, to conduct systems analysis of root causes of inequities. Systems are composed of an organized array of interdependent and interacting components. Systems can be transformed by finding high leverage points that can induce and reinforce ongoing change. The graphic on the screen is extensive and shows the complicated system and decision points within the justice system. There's a lot that goes into this type of systems analysis. During our time together and with your collaborative groups, we will focus on the institutionalized things and how policies and practices affect racial inequalities. While looking at your community's specific data and with consideration of the stakeholders you have at the table, you will determine the leverage point your collaborative will work on and start your in-depth data digging to identify the root cause of the inequity. It's important to note that you should choose one target area to start with and move on to others after you've finished. Trying to tackle multiple areas at the same time can be overwhelming and delay progress on all fronts. So in order to begin your in-depth analysis, you'll need to have data sources available to assist you in digging deeper. The data that you need will vary and depend on target area your collaborative has chosen to work on. The Department of Juvenile Justice has several interactive dashboards available that can assist in providing data for your specific county and area of focus. The delinquency profile, as pictured on the screen, can be a great resource for obtaining targeted data. This site allows you to choose your specific county and look at data in your area. You can look at the zip codes with the highest volume of referrals, as well as look at the numbers and types of offenses in those areas. In addition, you're provided with the breakdown of the juvenile population, and the arrest data is disaggregated by gender, race, and ethnicity, which is key when you're looking at disparity. The Regional Justice Reform Coordinator will be providing teams with the initial data to begin this process at the circuit level. You will begin by looking at some higher level data to determine what your team's area of focus will be to begin. Then you'll continue to peel away the layers as you dive deeper into the data provided by your coordinator. As we saw earlier in the presentation, we know that detention admissions for Black youth is significantly disproportionate to white youth, as well as to the Black youth population. Let's say, for example, that your collaborative group is focusing on detention admissions. A useful resource for gaining understanding and data digging would be the Detention Utilization Reports. This report provides insight on who is going into detention, what they are being detained for, and the length of stay in detention. This report can be provided by your regional coordinator for individual counties and can provide a lot of insight to many of the questions related to detention admissions. In the sample provided on the screen, we are looking at the quarterly report for Florida County with admissions beginning January 1st of 2018. The data in the chart shows the secure detention admissions for the specified quarter. We can see the data disaggregated by gender and determine how many male and female admissions there were, the number of admissions broken down by race and ethnicity, as well as the number of admissions based on charge type, whether a new offense or a technical violation. As we're looking at this detention data and the reasons youth are being admitted into secure detention, I'd like for you to take a minute and share what stands out to you about this data. Open the chat box again and share your thoughts. Natalie, can you join me again and share some of the responses when the time's up?
Well, it looks like we got some really great participation with this. Some of the common responses that I'm seeing are the disproportionality of overall admissions, more males than females, and lastly, the technical admissions are greater than those for actual offenses.
Right. Thank you, Natalie. Those are all things that are significant and can be target areas to begin your process. The local collaborative that was reviewing this data also thought that the technical admissions stood out and indicated a need to take a closer look at those technical violations to see what was going on. So technical admissions encompass failure to appear, other court orders, probation violations, abscond, and contempt of court. These types of admissions are typically status type offenses as opposed to committing a new crime. The data showed that the non-law VOP or violation of probation or other technical violation category made up approximately 39% of the overall detention admissions, which is significantly high. This showed that this would be a good target area to start peeling back a few more layers. Using the length of stay data, we can look at the race and ethnicity breakdown for each admission type, as well as compare the length of stay for each type of offense. Since the data brought us to the non-law VOP or other technical violations section, the collaborative looked at the disaggregation in that section. In this jurisdiction, this category typically comprises law enforcement violations of probation or violations of home detention, which is now supervised release. For those who are unaware, supervised release encompasses several types of pre-disposition community-based supervision. This includes home detention, evening or day reporting centers, intensive home detention, and electronic monitoring. The data shows that 69% of the youth detained for these technical violations were Black youth. In looking deeper into the non-law VOP and other technical violations category, it was determined that a slight majority of the cases were detained due to law enforcement violations of home detention. With this information, we determined to take a closer look at the youth who were detained specifically for violations of home detention. We then disaggregated the violation of home detention data and determined the race and ethnicity breakdown. 70% of the detention admissions for law enforcement violations of home detention were for Black youth. 23% of the admissions were for white youth, and 7% of the admissions were Hispanic youth. And knowing that Black youth make up approximately 58% of the overall admissions to secure detention statewide, it appeared significantly high that Black youth made up 70% of the admissions related to law enforcement violations of home detention. With that information, we wanted to look for trends to see if those numbers were consistent over a period of time. So we pulled the data for the 2018 calendar year, which is disaggregated per quarter and shown in the chart on the screen. As you can see, the numbers do fluctuate. However, across the board, Black youth are detained at a disproportionately higher rate during every quarter in 2018. 70% in quarter one, 68% in quarter two, 81% in quarter three, and 78% in quarter four. Additionally, the overall number of youth detained for violations of home detention per quarter is significantly high as well. To determine why the data appears this way, it was necessary to go even deeper into the data to determine the reasons these youth were being detained. In this data digging, it was found that the high number of youth detained for violations of home detention was in part related to wording on the home detention orders that required all youth who violate home detention be detained securely pending the detention hearing. This type of verbiage on a court order is not a standard in most circuits across the state and was specific to this particular county. This information provided at least part of the why that we were looking for. So this brings us to step number 5, which is to identify strategies and target resources to address root causes of inequities. After conducting a systems analysis to identify the root causes of inequities, you can then begin to surface possible strategies and solutions for addressing the problems. Through planning and engagement of your key stakeholders and partners, you will create ways to move solutions forward that can have significant impacts on systems and communities. Racially equitable solutions and policy proposals have an explicit goal of eliminating racial disparities and increasing racial equity. It's tempting to use proxies such as socioeconomic status or place, but race requires specific, distinct, and sufficient attention. Conscious consideration of racial equity during planning and decision-making helps counteract implicit or unconscious bias and prevent negative racial impacts. In the example we were just speaking about regarding violations of home detention, a collaborative meeting was held with all the necessary parties where the data and options were discussed. It was determined that the specific verbiage on the orders should not be a blanket requirement for all youth placed on home detention, and it was removed as the standard on the court orders. So we started with higher level data. We broke down that data to determine a why, used the data to identify a root issue, and then identified strategies to address and target the cause. So let's move on to the next step, which is to conduct race equity impact assessment for all policies and decision making. A racial equity impact assessment is a systematic examination of how a proposed action or decision will likely affect different racial and ethnic groups. It is a useful tool for assessing the actual or anticipated effect of proposed policies, institutional practices, programs, plans, and budgetary decisions. These questions can help you begin your race equity impact assessment. Are all racial and ethnic groups that are affected by the policy, practice, or decision at the table? How will the proposed policy, practice, or decision affect each group? How will the proposed policy, practice, or decision be perceived by each group? Does the policy, practice, or decision worsen or ignore existing disparities? And based on the above responses, what revisions are needed in the policy, practice, or decision under discussion? The racial equity impact assessment can be a vital tool to reduce, eliminate, and prevent racial discrimination and inequities and prevent institutional racism. This assessment will be discussed in greater detail during our next webinar. And finally, step 7 tells us to continuously evaluate effectiveness and adapt strategies. Once you've implemented change, you must ensure you tie the measures to specific desired outcomes. It's important to consistently assess whether investments are accomplishing stated racial equity goals. Organizations and systems should be assessing equity progress at every turn on an ongoing basis. Setting goals for the equity outcomes you are seeking, tracking results, and measuring progress and implementing needed course adjustments are critical to effectively doing this work. In our example, the change that was made on the verbiage of the court orders for home detention took effect at the end of Q1 of 2019. Let's take a look at the 2019 quarterly data to see what impact this change had on those numbers. So as you can see, there was a significant overall reduction in the number of youth detained for violations of home detention compared to the previous year. Q1 shows a reduction of 52% from 2018. Q2 shows a 59% reduction. Q3 had a 71% reduction, and Q4 had a 75% reduction from the same time frame in 2018. This is a huge reduction in numbers for detention admissions. In 2018, there were 311 admissions for this type of violation of home detention, which made up 17% of the overall detention admissions. However, in 2019, there were only 118 admissions, which only made up 9% of the overall detention admissions, which is huge. Next, we'll take a look at the disaggregated data to see what impact we had there. First, let's have another quick poll to see what you anticipate as the results. What type of change do you think we saw in the disproportionality rates in 2019 for youth detained for violations of home detention? Okay, so it's split pretty equally on what you think the results are. Let's look at the data. So when we look at the disaggregate data, unfortunately, the disproportionality of Black youth detained remains significantly high. Oftentimes, when doing this work and making changes, we will see this kind of impact, where we will see overall reductions, however, not necessarily seeing the decrease in disproportionality that was anticipated. When that happens, we need to go back to the table, reevaluate, and look at the new data. We'll need to review the data again with the race impact assessment to determine the steps needed to obtain greater reductions in the disproportionality rates. This is a continual process to evaluate and assess the effectiveness of your implemented changes to see if you're reaching the intended outcome. Keep in mind, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we are in this for the long haul for system change for race equity. But please do not discount the work that was done as a loss or a waste. As opposed to the disproportionality rates, let's look at the numbers specifically for Black youth who were detained for violations of home detention. As you can see, there was a significant overall reduction in the number of Black youth detained compared to the previous year. Q1 shows a reduction of 43% from 2018. Q2 shows a 47% reduction. Q3 had a 72% reduction, and Q4 had a 79% reduction. The changes that were made do show a significant reduction in numbers for Black youth detention admissions. In 2018, there were 226 admissions for this type of violation of home detention. However, in 2019, there were only 94 admissions, which shows an overall reduction of 58%, which is huge, and that should be celebrated as well. So to conclude, let's look one last time over each of the 7 steps. Remember that these steps are the framework for your local collaborative group as we work on race equity in our communities. Step 1, establish an understanding of race equity and inclusion principles. Everyone will receive the full action guide and is expected to review all of the core concepts. We want to ensure clear communication in our collaborative groups. Step 2, engage affected populations and stakeholders. Make sure that you have all the necessary people at the table who represent your community. If not, make sure you continue to invite those that are missing and continue to find ways to empower their voice. Step 3, gather and analyze disaggregated data, utilizing data as your starting point to guide all of your action steps in this process, so we are all starting from the same set of facts. Step 4, conduct systems analysis of root causes of inequalities. That's your data digging to determine the why. Step 5, identify strategies and target resources to address root causes of inequalities. Once you identify the root cause, you start strategizing solutions. Step 6, conduct race equity impact assessment for all policies and decision making. Use this guide as you're looking at solutions to maximize your chances of success. And step 7, continuously evaluate effectiveness and adapt strategies. This is not a one and done. This will be a continual process for you and your collaborative group. In your next meeting, I would like to encourage you to discuss the process we went through today and the example we provided, and talk about other ideas and strategies that should be considered. Lastly, I'll share our coordinator map. If you're not already familiar with who your regional coordinator is, please take down the information at this time for any specific questions you have regarding local data or methodology questions. Thank you so much for sticking with me during this webinar today. I'm going to invite Natalie back up to provide a little more information before we conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Everyone, Karen has done a fantastic job in showing us how data can be used to identify and eliminate practices that lead to disparate outcomes. So now the work begins for you and your team to dissect the practices utilized in your local area. When your group begins to take a look at some of these practices, ask yourself, is this practice punishing normal acts of youthful indiscretion? Is there a response to this behavior that does not propel kids further into the juvenile justice system? In the words of Adam Foss, all of us show up to this work to do a good job. but we may not have the proper tools or technology or training to do it in the way that we should. We hope that this block of the challenge is the beginning to bringing you the tools that you need to prioritize this work. We look forward to seeing you all for session 4 on August 5th, Assessing Race Equity and Policies with Lisa Gary. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.